Winter, 1878, the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana. Hunting dogs closed in as Josie collapsed in the snow, blood soaking through her coat. "Please, don't send me back to Thorn," she begged, trembling. Zane Holden lowered his lantern, his dark eyes fixed on the barn door. "No one is taking you." But when Thorn's gunmen arrived, three brothers would risk everything to protect her. Now let the story begin, and subscribe to follow Josie's fight for freedom. The hounds found her scent 2 miles back. Josie knew it. The moment the baying shifted pitch lower, more certain. The sound a pack makes when it stops searching and starts closing in. She'd heard that sound before, back at the camp, whenever someone ran. She always heard the screaming that came after it. Too, she ran harder. Her boots punched through the frozen crust with every step, sinking ankle-deep into the snow beneath. Each stride was a small disaster. Her left leg had gone mostly numb an hour ago. The cold had moved past burning and settled somewhere quieter, somewhere that scared her more. The tree line was maybe a quarter-mile ahead. Just the trees. Just get to the trees. She didn't let herself think past that. Thinking ahead was how you panicked. Panicking was how you fell. Falling in this snow, at this temperature, with those dogs behind her, that was how you died. So she kept her eyes on the dark wall of pine ahead, and she ran. Her coat was wrong for this kind of cold. It had been wrong since October, when the camp's overseer handed it out thin wool, barely a step above burlap, designed to keep a person just alive enough to keep working. She'd stuffed the inside with strips of cloth torn from an old flour sack. It helped. A little, not enough. The wound on her side didn't help either. She pressed her right arm against it as she moved. 3 days ago, one of Thorne's men had caught her trying to hide a letter she'd written. A letter meant for the Federal Postal Road. Meant for anyone who might care what was happening at the Thorne Labor Settlement, as the judge called it on official paper, as a debt collection facility, as his men called it when they thought no one was listening. He'd used a bridle strap across her ribs, not a whip. The overseer saved the whip for examples made in front of everyone. The strap was for private corrections. Quicker, quieter, harder to prove. 2 ribs, she thought. Maybe 3. She'd felt something shift wrong the first time she took a deep breath afterward. She didn't take deep breaths anymore. The pines swallowed her. The darkness under the canopy was almost total. Now the sun had gone down an hour ago, and what light remained came from the snow itself. That faint blue-gray glow that open ground gives off on a clear winter night. Under the trees, even that was gone. She slowed, not from choice. Her body was simply done explaining itself to her. Her legs moved because she told them to. But the messages were getting delayed, like shouting across a very large field. She could feel her pulse in her temples, in her side. In the tips of fingers she could no longer properly close. The hounds were still behind her. Closer, she found a creek bed frozen solid, smooth, a pale ribbon threading between the trees, and she turned and followed it. She'd read once, in a tattered almanac passed around the camp in secret. The dogs lost a scent trail on ice. She didn't know if that was true. She hoped it was true. She followed the creek. It led her uphill. She climbed. Her breath came in ragged. Visible clouds. Every exhale was a small flag planted in the night air, marking exactly where she was. She hated it. She pulled the front of her coat up over her mouth and breathed into the wool and kept moving. The creek curved left. She followed it. The trees thinned. And then, through the pines at the top of the rise, she saw it. Light. Not much. A single window. Orange warm against the blue-black dark. Maybe 200 yards above her. A structure she could make out the mass of it against the sky, something low and long, and then behind it, taller with a peaked roof. A barn. The house had light. The barn was dark. Josie understood immediately, and without having to think about it. She had spent enough time around people with power to understand how they used it. If she went to the house, she was asking for help. She was giving someone the choice to help her or hand her back. She was putting her fate in someone else's hands again. The barn was different. In a barn, you didn't have to ask. You just survived. The door was heavy. timber, and iron. But the latch was simple. Her fingers fumbled with it. For a terrible moment, she couldn't feel them properly, and she had to use both hands, pressing her palms flat against the iron because her grip wasn't working. The latch gave. The door swung inward on oiled hinges, mercifully quiet, and the smell rolled over her. Hay, horse's manure. Warmth, she almost cried. She slipped inside and pulled the door closed behind her with both hands, leaning into it until she heard the latch catch. The darkness was absolute. She stood still, back to the door, and just breathed the warm animal air. Let it reach the cold inside her chest. A horse shifted somewhere in the dark. A low, curious sound. She whispered, "It's all right. I won't bother you." She felt her way along the wall. Rough timber planks under her palms. Then the edge of a stall. Then hay deep. Piled hay along the back wall that gave off heat from below. From the earth, still holding what the summer had put into it. She pressed herself into the corner where the hay met the wall and pulled great armfuls of it over herself. She should stay awake. She knew she should stay awake. She lasted maybe 10 minutes. She was gone. She came back to consciousness one sense at a time. First, a lantern. The warm, specific orange of it through her closed eyelids. Second, cold air moving. The barn door. Open third, boots. The creak of floorboards under significant weight. Slow, deliberate steps that stopped and started someone reading the floor. Following something. Her blood. He was following her blood. Josie went completely still. She didn't move her body. She didn't change her breathing. She made herself small in the way she had learned to make herself small over 3 years at the camp. The specific, practiced art of becoming invisible while in plain sight. Steps stopped. She opened her eyes. He was standing at the entrance to her bay. The lantern was held low, not shown in her face. She noticed that immediately. He was holding it low so it lit the ground, and not her, and the man holding it was the largest human being she had ever been in a room with. Not fat, not soft, just large, in the particular way that comes from years of hard physical work. The kind that builds everything evenly. He was perhaps 30, dark-haired, wearing no coat despite the open barn door behind him. His shirt was open at the throat. He had a rifle slung across his back, and he had not touched it. He wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at the hay around her, at the trail she'd left getting to this corner, at the bloody handprint she hadn't realized she'd left on the stall post. Then he looked at her. His eyes were very dark, very quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't emptiness. It's the opposite of emptiness. It's a person who has learned to hold a great deal inside, without it spilling over. He did not say a word. He turned his head toward the open barn door and made a short, low sound, more breath than voice, and then he stepped back 2 full paces and set the lantern on the floor, not beside her, between them. Then he stepped back again, putting himself against the far wall of the stall, and crouched down, setting himself at her level, getting small. Josie's brain was working slowly, like a river running under ice. She watched him make himself smaller, and she could not immediately understand why he was doing it. She heard more boots outside, 2 sets, coming fast. Then, slowing, he must have signaled them too, somehow, and then 2 more men appeared in the barn door. Brothers. She saw it immediately. Same frame, same darkness about them, though the oldest had more gray at his temples and a face with more lines in it. And the middle one was broader, across the shoulders, than either of the others. The oldest wore a proper coat and had been dressed to go out. The middle one had come straight from a fire somewhere. She could see the heat flush on his forearms, the leather apron still tied at his waist. All 3 of them saw her. All 3 of them stopped. The oldest held up a hand easy, gentle, the gesture you'd use near a spooked animal, and the middle one went still immediately. No one spoke. The oldest surveyed the situation in a couple of seconds, and then he turned and looked at the youngest, still crouched against the wall. And something passed between them that wasn't words. The youngest, the dark-haired one who'd found her, shook his head slightly. Not hurt, not armed. The oldest nodded. He reached up slowly, and Josie tracked the movement, with every animal instinct still firing in her depleted body and pulled a heavy wool blanket from the top of the stall divider. He gave her a clear look at it, let her see what it was. Then he turned his wrist and tossed it. Easy, underhanded. So it fell across her legs and lower body like a settling wing. It hit her like standing next to a fire. She grabbed it without thinking and pulled it up. And it was so warm, so deeply warm, that her eyes blurred. She would not cry. She absolutely would not cry in front of these men. The oldest man spoke then. His voice was even and low, the kind of voice that expected to be listened to without having to raise itself. "Nobody here is going to touch you," he said. "You're safe for tonight. You can sleep." Josie stared at him. Her mouth was dry. Her hands were shaking, and she could feel the shaking now, which meant warmth was reaching her extremities, which meant things were working again. "The dogs," she managed. Her voice came out wrecked. "Barely there. Thorne's men. They're maybe an hour behind me." The oldest man looked at the middle one. Something decided in both their faces. The middle one touched the younger one on the shoulder as he passed and went back out into the night. The youngest stayed where he was, in his corner, crouched down, not looking at her, directly looking at the floor near her. The way you'd look near a deer, you didn't want to bolt. The oldest looked back at her. "We'll handle that," he simply, like it was already decided, and the deciding was done. She wanted to ask how. She wanted to ask who they were. She had about 14 questions lined up, good practical questions, the kind that might save her life. She couldn't hold on long enough to ask any of them. The blanket was so warm, and the hay was so deep, and the men had stepped back and not touched her, had made themselves smaller instead of larger. And some part of her body that had been locked rigid for 3 years just let go. She was asleep before she heard the barn door close. The youngest brother remained, cross-legged now, back against the wall, lantern turned down low, watching the door, watching the dark. Outside, bootsteps moved through the snow steady, unhurried, heading toward the tree line. The hounds had reached the creek. Their baying drifted up through the pines. It stopped a few minutes later. It did not start again. Josie woke to sunlight and the smell of coffee. For a moment, she didn't move. She lay very still under a heap of quilts, in a bed that was not the hay pile in the barn, in a room with a low log ceiling and a window with actual glass in it. And she tried to work out how she'd gotten here without being able to remember the walk. Someone must have carried her. That thought made her stomach drop. She sat up too fast. Pain lanced through her ribs, and she gasped, pressing a hand to her side. And a voice from across the room said, "Easy. You cracked something back there. Go slow." She looked over. The middle brother, the blacksmith, she'd guess, from the leather apron folded over a chair, was sitting near the hearth mending a harness strap, not looking directly at her, giving her room to get her bearings without an audience. "Where?" she started, and her voice cracked. She tried again. "Where am I?" "Holden Place," he said. "Foothills of the Bitterroot Range. You walked about 6 miles last night before you gave out. That's some walking. For someone in your condition. The dogs, gone. Turn back around before sunup." He set the harness down, finally, and looked at her full on. Not sideways, and she saw a broad, open face, sun-weathered, with lines at the eyes that came from squinting into forge fire, not from cruelty. "My brother Zane tracked them a ways, made sure they lost interest. You're not being followed this morning. That much I can promise you." She didn't fully believe it. 3 years of a certain kind of life doesn't let a person believe a promise that fast. But her body believed the bed, at least, and the warmth, and she let herself sink back a few inches into the pillow. "Cole," he said, tapping his own chest. "That's my name." Wyatt's outside seeing to the stock. "Zane you already met." "Josie," she said. It felt strange in her mouth. She hadn't said her own name out loud in longer than she could easily remember. "At the camp you were a number stitched onto a collar." Josephine Vance had been retired the day she arrived there. "Josie," Cole repeated, like he was setting the word down carefully somewhere. "There's coffee if you want it. And Wyatt's got broth going. For your stomach, since you likely haven't had a real meal in some time." He was right about that, too. She ate slowly, sitting up against the headboard, and the 3 of them gave her space to do it. Wyatt came in partway through, stamping snow off his boots at the door. And he had the kind of bearing that told her exactly what he'd been before this, a man who'd worn a uniform once, who still stood like the uniform was there, even without it. He nodded at her, said good morning, plain and unhurried, and went to the stove to pour his own coffee. Nobody asked her questions yet. Nobody hovered. Zane came in around midday with a brace of rabbits and barely looked at her at all, which she understood was its own kind of consideration. Some people, when they've been hurt, don't want eyes on them. He'd figured that out about her already, apparently, from one glance in a dark barn. It was strange, being handled so carefully by men his size. By afternoon, her strength had come back enough to feel the full weight of her situation pressing on her again. She was in a stranger's house. She had nothing. No money, no family within 500 miles, no legal standing. Because as far as the state of things stood, she was still property under a signed debt contract. And property that runs is property that gets returned, one way or another, to whoever holds the paper. She knew how this worked. She'd need to make herself useful, or she'd need to offer something else. That was simply the arithmetic of her life since she was 19 years old. So when Wyatt came in that evening to check on her, she reached into the lining of her coat, where she'd sewn a hidden pocket a year ago for exactly this kind of moment, and pulled out the folded, water-stained paper that had governed the last 3 years of her existence. "I want to be honest with you," she said, holding it out. Her hand was shaking, but she kept her voice steady. "This is my debt contract. Thorn will come looking eventually, one way or another. And I understand you three have already put yourselves at some risk taking me in." Wyatt didn't take the paper yet. He just looked at it in her hand. "I can work," she said. "I'm not afraid of work. I can cook. I can sew. I can tend animals. I've done laundry and mending for 40 men at a time." Or, and this was the part that cost her something to say, the part her whole body wanted to refuse to say, "If that's not what's needed. I understand there are other arrangements a woman in my position sometimes has to make. I'd rather offer it plainly than have it assumed." The room went very quiet. Cole, over by the stove, stopped what he was doing entirely. Zane, seated near the door cleaning a rifle, went still in a way that felt loud. Somehow, though he made no sound at all, Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and took the contract from her hand, gently the way you'd take something fragile from a child. He read it. She watched his jaw tighten as his eyes moved down the page, the terms of her debt, inherited from a father who'd died owing money to the wrong man. The interest that compounded monthly. The labor rates set so low that the debt could never actually be worked off, only maintained. Forever. A life sentence dressed up as a contract. He walked to the hearth. He dropped it in the fire. Josie made a small, startled sound and half rose off the bed before the pain in her ribs stopped her. That was my only copy. That's proof of what they did. I could have used that." "Thorne's got a dozen copies in his ledger book," Wyatt said, watching the paper curl and blacken. "This one wasn't proof of anything, except a man believing he owned another person. I won't have it in this house." He turned to face her fully. "Nobody owns anybody on this ranch," he said. "You're not going to work off a debt here, because you don't owe us one. You're not going to warm anybody's bed as payment, because payment isn't what a bed is for. If you stay, you work, because that's how a household runs, and everybody in it pulls their weight, same as us. You eat what we eat. You get paid the same respect any hired hand would get, except you're not hired, because a Holden doesn't hire family." She stared at him. "I'm not family." "Not yet," Cole said from the stove. Easy, like it was obvious. "Give it time." "Human beings," Wyatt said, and his voice dropped into something quieter, something that felt like it mattered more for being quiet. A not property to be leveraged. Not by Thorn. Not by a bad debt. Not by circumstance. And not by us either. I don't care what paper says otherwise. Paper's just ink until somebody with a gun decides to enforce it. And I've got a gun too." Josie sat very still. She had been treated many ways in 3 years. She had been treated as inventory, as a body that produced labor, as a number on a ledger that Thorne's men reconciled every Sunday evening with a cold, businesslike efficiency that had somehow felt worse than cruelty. Because cruelty at least meant someone was paying attention to her as a person, even to hurt her. Nobody in 3 years had looked her in the eye and told her she wasn't for sale. Something in her chest came loose. Not a metaphor she could name easily, just a physical sensation, like a held breath finally let go. Except she hadn't known she was holding it until it left. Her eyes filled, and she pressed the heel of her hand against them, embarrassed, furious at herself for crying in front of these strangers. "I don't know how to just be given something," she said, muffled, into her hand. "There's always a price. There's always a catch." "There's a price," Zane said. It was the first full sentence she'd heard him speak. His voice was low and rough, like it didn't get used much. "You cook decent. Cole here burns everything he touches that isn't metal." "I do not burn everything," Cole said. "You burned the beans Tuesday." Those beans were already suspect. Josie laughed a small, wet, startled laugh. The kind that surprises the person doing it, and Wyatt allowed himself something close to a smile. "Watching her, that's the whole price," he said. "Pull your weight when you're able. Speak your mind. And don't ever offer yourself to a man like that again. Not to us. Not to anybody. You're worth more than a debt paid in kind. And someday you'll believe that." She didn't believe it yet. Not all the way, but she believed, for the first time in 3 years, that it might be possible to believe it eventually. And that felt like more ground than she'd been standing on in a very long time. The willow bark tea tasted like a mistake somebody kept making on purpose. "Bitter," Josie said, grimacing over the cup. "Bitter's the medicine talking," Cole said, from where he was stripping bark off a fresh branch at the kitchen table, his big hands surprisingly delicate with the small knife. "Willow bark's nature's own aspirin, my grandmother used to say. Cuts the fever, eases the ache in your ribs. You want it to taste like candy. Go find yourself a different injury." "I didn't go looking for this one." "No," he agreed. "Just came with it anyway." "Drink up." She drank. It didn't get better the second sip, but her ribs had been a low, grinding presence for 4 days now. And if bitter tea took the edge off it, she'd drink a gallon of the stuff. Wyatt had gone into town for supplies. Zane was out checking traps along the tree line, the way he did most mornings before the sun was fully up, moving through the woods like something that belonged there more than the trees did. That left the cabin to Josie and Cole, and a slow, unhurried morning of the kind she hadn't experienced since she was a girl. He came around the table with a jar of crushed yarrow leaves, the smell sharp and green and a little medicinal, and set it beside her. "Let me see the side," he said. She hesitated. 3 days of him tending the whip marks on her back and the deep bruising along her ribs had gotten her mostly used to it. But mostly used to it still had a distance to travel before it became easy. "You don't have to look away every time," she said, half a question. "I know I don't have to." He said it simply, not defensively. "Doesn't mean I'm going to stop asking first. Lift your shirt where you're comfortable and no further." She did. He worked with the quiet, careful attention of a man handling something he respected, packing the crushed yarrow against the worst of the bruising, wrapping a clean strip of cloth around her ribs to hold it in place. His hands were rough blacksmith's hands, calloused from years of hammer and tongs, but the roughness never once turned into carelessness. He was careful in the specific way of someone who has learned, through practice, exactly how much pressure a thing can take. "Yarrow stops bleeding," he said, as he worked. "Slows it down, anyhow. Soldiers used to carry it into battle for that reason. Same plant that looks like a weed along every roadside in the territory. Funny thing about medicine, half of it's growing right where nobody thinks to look. You know a lot about this. Had to learn. Man runs a smithy. He gets burned, gets cut, gets his hand caught somewhere it shouldn't be. You can't ride into town every time you singe yourself. So you learn what grows nearby and what it's good for." He tied off the bandage, sat back, looked at his work with a critical eye. "That'll hold. How's the breathing?" She took a testing breath, still sharp, but manageable. "Better. Good." She pulled her shirt back down and watched him gather up the leftover yarrow, wrap it carefully in a cloth, and set it on the shelf where he kept what she'd come to understand was a small, informal apothecary jars and pouches of dried plants, each one labeled in a blocky hand. "Would you teach me?" she asked, before she'd fully decided to ask it. He looked over. "Teach you what?" "This, the plants. What they're for." She held her own hands out, looked at them chapped, thin, but not injured anymore, mostly healed. "I've spent 3 years being useful to other people on their terms. I'd like to be useful on my own, for a change. And I'd like to know how to fix a hurt without waiting on somebody else to do it for me." Something shifted in his face approval. Maybe, or something warmer than approval. "I can do that," he said. "Come by the smithy this afternoon. If you're up for walking that far, I'll show you the yarrow patch out back of it, and the willow stand along the creek." The smithy sat 40 yards from the cabin, a low timber structure with the forge glowing orange in its dim interior even in daylight, heat rolling off it in visible waves. Josie stood in the doorway that afternoon and felt the wall of warmth hit her before she'd even stepped inside. "Careful of the floor near the anvil," Cole said, working the bellows with one steady arm, the coals brightening and dimming with each pump. "Scale flies off the hot iron when I'm hammering. Looks like nothing. Cuts like glass." She watched him work a length of iron, heating it, drawing it out of the coals glowing near white, laying it on the anvil and striking it with a rhythm that was almost musical. 3 hard blows, a turn, 3 more, a turn again, the metal slowly bending itself into the shape of a hinge under his patient insistence. "How do you know how hot's hot enough?" she asked. "Color," he said, without looking up. "Dull red's too cool. Won't move right. You'll crack it trying to force it. Bright orange, that's your working range. White, you're close to burning it. And burnt iron's ruined iron. No fixing it after that." He glanced at her. "Or dust's the real danger, though not the fire itself. Fire you can see coming. Dust settles on everything, gets kicked up, and if it gets thick enough in a closed space and meets a spark." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The look on his face did the finishing for him. "It's happened before," she asked. "Once before my time. My father's smithy, back east. Lost half the roof and near lost his hearing in one ear. Taught the whole family to respect it after that. Ore dust builds up in the corners, in the rafters. Any place it settles and doesn't get swept. You want it swept regular, and you want to know where it's thickest. Because a man who understands how his own forge can turn against him is a man who's less likely to get surprised by it." She filed that away without entirely understanding why it mattered to her, beyond simple curiosity. It felt like the kind of thing worth knowing, a tool that could hurt you or help you, depending on how well you understood it. "Show me," she said, "the dust, where it collects." He looked at her a moment, a longer moment than the question seemed to call for. And then he nodded, wiped his hands on his apron, and walked her through the smithy, pointing out the rafters, the corners behind the bellows, the loose floorboards near the door, where the fine black powder gathered like a shadow that never quite swept away. "You're a quick study," he said, when she'd repeated it back to him accurately. "I've had to be," she said. "Nobody teaches you twice. Where I came from, different here," Cole said. "I'll teach you as many times as you need." She believed him, and more than that. For the first time in longer than she could measure, she found herself wanting to learn something, not because her life depended on it, but simply because it was hers to know. They came on the 9th day, 4 riders moving up the frozen road at an easy pace that was somehow more unsettling than a hard gallop would have been. Men who weren't in a hurry were men who were certain of the outcome. Zane saw them first. He always saw everyone first. It was a fact of the household by now. Unremarkable. Like Cole always burning the second pot of coffee, or Wyatt always waking before dawn out of old habit. He came through the cabin door without knocking, which he never did, and that alone told Wyatt everything he needed to know before Zane said a word. 4 riders, Zane said, half-mile out. One's carrying papers in a saddlebag, holding them like they matter to him. Wyatt was already reaching for his coat. "Josie," he said, calm, no rise in his voice at all. "Go on back to the smithy with Cole. Stay behind the forge wall till this is settled." She didn't argue. 3 years of surviving Thorne's operation had taught her when a moment called for arguing, and when it called for doing exactly what you were told, fast and without complaint. And this was plainly the second kind. Cole took her arm, not pulling, just guiding, and walked her quickly out the back toward the smithy, where the thick stone hearth wall would stop a rifle round if it came to that. Wyatt walked out onto the porch alone and waited. The 4 riders came up the drive at that same unhurried pace and reined in maybe 20 feet from the porch steps. Josie, watching through a gap in the smithy's timber wall, recognized the lead man immediately. Garrett, one of Thorne's senior bounty men. A lean, sun-cured figure with pale eyes and a badge he'd bought rather than earned. Behind him rode 3 others she didn't know, all armed, all watching the cabin windows with the flat, calculating attention of men used to trouble. Wyatt Holden, Garrett said, by way of greeting. Garrett. Wyatt stood with his hands loose at his sides, unhurried. Unarmed in plain sight, though. Josie suspected that wasn't the whole truth of it. Long ride out from the settlement. Hope it was worth your while. Got word of runaways holed up on your property. Woman, 22. Answers to Josephine Vance. Bound by contract to Judge Thorne's labor settlement. Still owing on her debt. Garrett reached into his saddlebag and produced a folded document, holding it up without offering to hand it over. Got a federal warrant here authorizing her return. Federal, Wyatt repeated. Something in his tone had shifted, not louder, just sharper, like a blade being turned edge on. That's an interesting word to use on a piece of paper Judge Thorne wrote himself. It's got a seal on it. I was cavalry for 9 years, Garrett. Served under men who dealt directly with federal marshals, territorial courts, the whole apparatus. I know exactly what a federal warrant looks like, and I know exactly what a county judge's forged approximation of one looks like. And I'll tell you plainly, from here, that seal's wrong. Federal seals carry an eagle with 13 arrows in the left talon and an olive branch in the right. Yours has got the arrows and branch reversed. Small detail. Tells a big story. Garrett's jaw tightened. You calling the judge a forger? I'm calling his paperwork sloppy. Draw your own conclusions. Wyatt's voice never rose. And even setting the seal aside, you're citing a debt labor contract as grounds for forcible return of a private citizen. That practice was outlawed under the Peonage Act 4 years back, on the federal books, over the county's head. A man can't be legally bound to work off a debt through forced labor. Neither can a woman. Doesn't matter what paper Thorne's got her signed to. The paper itself is unenforceable, has been since the act passed, and any officer attempting to enforce it is committing a federal offense himself. From the direction of the smithy came the heavy, rhythmic clang of a hammer on iron coal, striking the anvil with slow, deliberate force, not hiding his presence, making sure every rider on that drive understood exactly how many able-bodied men occupied this property, and precisely how strong at least one of them was. Garrett's eyes flicked toward the sound. That's my brother, Wyatt said, mild as Sunday conversation. Cole doesn't much care for legal argument, prefers to let his hammer do the talking. And my other brother? He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. From the hayloft window above the barn, a thin red line of light caught the falling snow and settled, quiet and precise, directly between Garrett's eyes. Zane hadn't moved from his position, hadn't made a sound, hadn't done anything except exist exactly where a man needed to exist to make his point, without a single word spoken. Garrett went very still. The 3 riders behind him shifted in their saddles, and one of them let his hand drift toward his hip. And Wyatt's voice cracked out, the first time it had actually risen. Don't. Nobody moved. Here's how this concludes, Wyatt said, into the silence. You ride back to the settlement. You tell Thorne his warrant's invalid on 2 separate counts, and that I'll be filing a formal complaint with the Territorial Marshal's Office regarding attempted enforcement of an outlawed peonage contract, with your names attached as witnesses to the attempt. You tell him if he sends more men out here, I'll have federal cause to charge every one of them with attempted kidnapping, which carries considerably worse consequences than a debt dispute. And you tell him Wyatt added, quieter now, that there's no woman on this property who belongs to anyone but herself. Not to him, not to us. Herself, Garrett sat his horse for a long, tense moment, the rifle light steady on his forehead, the hammer still ringing from the smithy, the whole tableau frozen in the cold afternoon air. Then he wheeled his horse around, sharp, and the other three followed, and the four of them rode back down the drive at considerably more speed than they'd arrived with. Wyatt watched them go until they disappeared around the bend in the road. Only then did his shoulders drop half an inch, the only outward sign that any of it had cost him something. Josie came out from behind the smithy wall slowly, her legs unsteady. Cole a step behind her with the hammer still loose in his hand. That paper, she said, the one about outlawed contracts. Is that real? Real as anything's ever real when it comes to the law. Wyatt said, real enough that Thorne knows I'm not bluffing about the complaint. The law protects you on paper. Josie always has, when it's written right. Problem is paper alone's never stopped a man determined to ignore it. That's what today was for, making sure Thorne understands that ignoring the law here comes with a cost he can see plainly, in more than ink. Above them, in the hayloft, Zane finally lowered the rifle and climbed down without a word, and went back to checking his traps as if nothing at all had happened. But something had. Josie understood it clearly. Standing in the trampled snow of the drive, watching the empty road where four armed men had just backed down from three brothers and a woman they'd once considered property. For the first time since she'd fled the settlement, she let herself believe she might actually be safe here. The cold deepened through the back half of winter, the way it always did in the high country, until the world outside the cabin windows turned into something flat and white and endless. Josie stopped counting days somewhere around the third week. It wasn't that time had stopped mattering. It was that, for the first time in 3 years, she wasn't counting down toward anything. There was no debt clock running in her head anymore. There was just the next meal, the next chore, the next quiet evening by the fire. She noticed the men differently now that the fear had drained out of her. Wyatt she noticed in the mornings. He was always up first, always at the table, with a ledger and a cup of black coffee, working through the numbers of the ranch, the way another man might work, through scripture, methodical, unhurried, like the discipline of it mattered as much as the answer. He didn't talk much before 9 o'clock. She'd learned not to expect it, and somewhere along the way, she'd started to like the quiet they shared instead. Two people working at the same table, without needing to fill the space between them with words. One morning, she caught him watching her over the rim of his coffee cup, and instead of looking away like she might have a month ago, she held his gaze and said, "You're doing the thing again." "What thing?" "Adding me into your numbers. I can see you doing arithmetic behind your eyes." He almost smiled. It was a rare enough thing that it changed his whole face when it happened. "I was thinking we'd need another laying hen or two. Come spring, if you're planning on staying through summer." "Am I planning on staying through summer?" "That's your decision to make," he said. "I'm just doing the arithmetic in case." She thought about that for the rest of the day. In case, like her staying, was a good outcome he was quietly hoping for, without ever once pressuring her toward it. Cole, she noticed, in the afternoons, in the smithy, where their lessons had turned from simple curiosity into something closer to a real education. She could identify 8 different plants by now, knew which ones stopped bleeding and which ones settled a fever, and which ones you left strictly alone unless you knew exactly what you were doing. She'd learned to bank the forge fire properly, to sweep the corners where the ore dust gathered, to respect the whole operation the way Cole respected it, which was to say, completely, without ever once being afraid of it. He laughed easily and often, and his laughter had started doing something to her chest that she didn't have a polite name for. He teased her about her aim. With the hammer she was getting better, but she was nowhere near his level, and never would be, given the difference in their strength, and she teased him back about the beans, which he genuinely had burned twice more since Wyatt first mentioned it. and there was an ease between them that felt dangerously close to something she hadn't let herself want in a very long time. Zane she noticed everywhere and nowhere. He didn't sit at the table much. He didn't linger by the fire in the evenings the way his did. But she'd started finding things, a rabbit already skinned, and left by the kitchen door on a morning, her ribs were paining her too much to manage the work herself. An extra shawl draped over the back of her chair. On a night, the wind had been especially cruel. The exact herbs Cole had mentioned, she was running low on, gathered and left in a neat little bundle on the smithy bench without a word said about where they'd come from. She asked him about it once, directly, catching him at the woodpile. "You don't have to keep doing that," she said, leaving things. "I can manage." Zane kept splitting wood, the axe rising and falling in a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. "No, you can manage," he said, after a while. "Doesn't mean you should have to, every single day, when it's easy enough for me not to." That's not really an answer. He set the axe down, looked at her, finally, straight on, the way he rarely did. "Don't talk much," he said. "Never have. Doesn't mean I'm not paying attention. Probably pay more attention than the other two, on account of not talking, taking up the space where the noticing happens." It was the longest thing she'd ever heard him say. She stood there in the cold, with an armful of kindling, and felt something shift loose in her chest. Something that had been locked tight since long before the debt camp. Maybe since her father died. Maybe since she was a girl who'd learned early that depending on people generally ended in disappointment. She was in trouble. She understood that clearly, standing at the woodpile with Zane Holden, watching her with those dark, quiet, endlessly attentive eyes. She wasn't falling for one of these men. She was falling for all three of them, in three completely different ways. And she had absolutely no idea what a woman was supposed to do with a fact like that. She brought it up to nobody. She sat with it for days, turning it over, trying to talk herself into believing it was simple gratitude, simple safety, simple relief, mistaking itself for something deeper. But gratitude didn't make her chest go tight when Cole laughed at something, she said. Safety didn't make her watch Wyatt's hands at the ledger and wonder what those same hands would feel like doing something gentler than arithmetic. Relief didn't make her lie awake, some nights aware of every sound in the cabin, aware of exactly which room each brother slept in, aware of some low current running underneath the whole household that she couldn't name honestly, not even to herself. She didn't know that the brothers had noticed her noticing. It happened on an evening she'd gone to bed early, worn out from a full day helping Cole reorganize the smithy's herb shelf. The three brothers sat by the fire the way they usually did after she'd turned in. Wyatt with his ledger, Cole mending something with his hands, Zane simply still, staring into the flames. It was Cole who finally said it. "She's got feelings for all three of us." Nobody argued the point. Wyatt didn't even look up from his ledger, which told Zane and Cole both that their older brother had already worked through this particular piece of arithmetic some time ago. "Question is what we do about it," Cole said. "Nothing," Wyatt said. "We do nothing that pressures her into deciding anything before she's ready." "That's not really an answer either," Cole said, echoing, without knowing it, the exact words Josie had used on Zane at the woodpile. Wyatt set the ledger down, looked at his brothers, one and then the other, with the particular gravity he brought to things that actually mattered to him. "I love her," he said. Plain, no hedging in it at all. "Have for a while now. I expect you both do too. And I expect we've all known it separate from each other, without saying it out loud, on account of none of us wanting to be the one who makes this complicated first." Cole nodded slowly. Zane, silent as ever, nodded too. "Here's what I won't do," Wyatt continued. "I won't have her choosing between us, like she's picking out livestock at auction. I won't have this family split apart over a woman none of us can blame for wanting all three of us. Because from where I sit, wanting all three of us is a perfectly reasonable position, given how good we are. A small dry humor in that, easing the weight of the moment. What I will do is love her honestly, alongside you both, and let her decide in her own time what shape that love takes. If she wants one of us, she'll have him, and the other two will stand as family regardless. If she wants all three, he didn't finish. He didn't need to. Some things. Out on the frontier, in households built out of necessity and hardship, found their own shape without needing every detail spoken aloud. Plenty of ranch families ran that way, quietly, out past the reach of town gossip. 3 or 4 adults raising a household together in whatever configuration worked, because survival mattered more than what the church 3 counties over might think of the arrangement. She has to choose it herself, Zane said. Quiet, but absolutely certain. Nobody chooses it for her. Not us, not each other, her. Agreed, Wyatt said. Cole raised his mending needle like it was a toast. Agreed, he said too. And something in the room settled. 3 brothers bound together by blood, and now, increasingly, by a shared and entirely unhurried devotion to a woman who was, at that exact moment, upstairs, wide awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering exactly the same thing they were. The storm came in on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday morning it had a name in Josie's head that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with the way it felt. Total, complete, absolute. It buried the drive in 4 feet of snow within 20 hours. It knocked the visibility down to nothing past the porch rail. It howled around the cabin's corners all through that first night with a sound like something enormous grieving. Storm like this, Wyatt said, checking the shutters for the 3rd time. We don't leave this cabin till it breaks. Could be 2 days. Could be 5. We've got supplies, Josie asked. We've got supplies for a month, if it came to that, Cole said, from the hearth, where he was banking the fire, high enough to hold through the night. Wyatt doesn't do anything by half measures, including stocking a pantry. It was strange. At first, the sheer closeness of it. 4 adults in a cabin built for 3, snow piling against the windows, until the light coming through turned pale and blue even at midday. No way out. No way for anyone else to get in either. Josie had spent 3 years learning to survive by staying alert to every exit, every possibility of escape, every door that might close on her without warning. And here was a door closed by nature itself, sealing her inside with 3 men she was, by that point, entirely and helplessly in love with. And instead of panic, what rose up in her was something closer to relief. Nobody could reach them here. Not Thorne, not his hounds. Not the whole ugly machinery of the debt settlement that had defined her adult life. Just this cabin, this fire, and these 3 men. For as long as the storm chose to keep them, they fell into a rhythm quickly. Mornings were for chores that could still be done indoors mending. Cleaning weapons. Cole working small repairs at a portable bench he'd dragged in from the smithy, rather than risk the walk out to it in the whiteout. Afternoons, when the light allowed it, were for cards, or for Wyatt reading aloud from one of the handful of books the household owned, his voice low and even, filling the cabin with something other than the storm's noise. Evenings were the part Josie hadn't expected to love as much as she did. They talked, really talked, the kind of talking that only happens when there's nowhere else to be, and nothing else demanding your attention. Wyatt told her about the cavalry, not the parts that made for good stories, but the harder truths underneath them. The disillusionment that had eventually driven him out of that life and up into these mountains to build something quieter with his brothers. Cole told her about their mother, who died when he was 12, and how their father had taught all 3 boys to cook and sew and mend, because a household of men alone still needed those things done, and there was no sense pretending otherwise out of pride. Slowly, over the course of several evenings, told her about tracking not the mechanics of it, but the feeling of it, the particular stillness a person had to hold inside themselves to read a landscape properly, to notice what other people walked straight past. She told them things too, things she hadn't said out loud to anyone, about her father, about the debt that had swallowed her whole after his death, about the specific humiliations of the settlement that she'd never once spoken of, not even to herself in the privacy of her own head. 'cause saying them made them real in a way she hadn't been able to bear. They listened, all three of them, without flinching, without pity that curdled into something uncomfortable, without ever once making her feel smaller for having survived what she'd survived. By the third night of the storm, something in her had shifted permanently. She caught her reflection that evening in the small mirror hung by the wash basin, and, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she let herself actually look. The scars were still there. The thin white line across her collarbone from the strap. The rougher patch along her ribs where a burn had healed wrong, years back, from an accident at the settlement's laundry vats. Her body told the story of 3 years she hadn't chosen and couldn't undo, written into her skin in a language anyone could read, if they looked closely enough. She had spent those 3 years believing that story made her less desirable, less worthy of a gentle hand or a soft word. She had built an entire private architecture of shame around every mark on her body, brick by brick, until she genuinely believed no decent person could look at her without seeing damaged goods. And then she thought about Cole's hands, careful and respectful, tending those same scars without a flicker of disgust. She thought about Wyatt's voice, steady and certain, telling her nobody owned anybody, that her worth wasn't tied to a debt or a body or anything else that could be written on paper. She thought about Zane, watching her at the woodpile, with an attention so complete it had nearly undone her, an attention that had never once, in all these weeks, made her feel like an object being assessed rather than a person being seen. None of them had ever looked at her scars like they were a flaw to be overlooked in spite of everything else, if anything. She suspected, though she wasn't ready to say it aloud yet, even to herself, that they saw the scars as evidence of exactly how much she'd already survived, and respected her more for it, not less. The shame didn't vanish all at once. Shame built up over 3 years doesn't dissolve in a single evening, no matter how gentle the company. But something cracked that night, a hairline fracture running through a wall she'd built so long ago she'd nearly forgotten it was a wall at all. And through the crack came a thought. She hadn't let herself think in years. I get to choose. Not Thorn, not the debt, not circumstance, or fear, or the desperate calculus of survival that had governed every decision she'd made since her father died. Here, snowed into this cabin with these 3 men, she was, for the first time in her adult life, a free woman looking at 3 people who loved her and wondering, honestly, what she actually wanted, instead of what she needed to do to survive another day. She wanted all 3 of them. She'd known it for weeks now. In the same way you know a storm is coming before the first flake falls. A pressure building, somewhere behind your ribs that has nothing to do with weather. She'd been afraid of the wanting, afraid of what it said about her, afraid of asking for something so plainly outside the bounds of what a proper woman was supposed to want. But there was no proper woman out here. There was no minister 3 counties over whose opinion mattered more than her own peace. There was just her and the storm, and 3 good men who had never once asked her to be smaller than she actually was. She sat on the edge of the bed a long while, listening to the wind work at the shutters, and somewhere in that listening, the fear finally loosened its grip, enough for something steadier to take its place. Whatever happened when this storm broke, she was done letting shame make her choices for her. That part, at least, was entirely her own to decide. The fever came on quiet, the way fevers sometimes do, sneaking in under the cover of the storm, so nobody noticed until Josie was already shivering hard enough to rattle the headboard. Cole found her first, coming in to bank the fire before turning in, and one look at her face told him everything he needed to know. Flushed cheeks, glassy eyes, the particular restless movement of someone caught between waking and a bad dream. Wyatt, he called, not loud, but with an edge that brought his brother in from the other room fast. She's running hot. Wyatt crossed to the bed and laid the back of his hand against her forehead, and his jaw tightened at what he found there. Not dangerous yet, but we watch her close tonight. He looked toward the door. Zane was already there. He always seemed to already be there. whenever it mattered. They didn't discuss it as a decision. It simply happened. The way certain things happen in a household that has learned to move as one unit, all three of them, gathering around the big bed near the hearth. Cole adding wood until the fire threw its light generous and warm across the quilts. Wyatt bringing a basin of cool water and a cloth. Zane simply sitting. Close a steady and quiet presence at the foot of the bed. Josie surfaced slowly out of the fever dream that had gripped her. She'd been back at the settlement in the dream, back in the cold barracks, back under the weight of a debt that never shrank no matter how much of herself she gave to it. She opened her eyes and found firelight instead, and three faces watching her with such open concern that the dream let go of her all at once, like a hand releasing something. It had been gripping too hard. "You're all right," Wyatt said, low. "Fever's not bad. You had us worried a moment, is all." She was shaking anyway, more from the dream's residue than the fever itself. And Cole reached out without being asked and rubbed slow circles across her upper back, the way you'd settle a spooked horse, warm and steady and undemanding. His fingers caught, without meaning to, on the raised line of scar tissue along her shoulder blade. She flinched. It wasn't pain. Cole's touch had never once caused her pain. Not once in all the weeks he'd tended her. It was something else entirely. Something that came up from a much older place. The sudden, sharp awareness that she was here, in a bed, surrounded by three men who could see and feel exactly how marked her body was, and some small. Frightened part of her still expected that knowledge to change how they looked at her. Cole went still immediately. "Did that hurt?" "No," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. "No, it's not that." She sat up against the headboard, pulling the quilt around herself, and looked at the three of them in the firelight. Wyatt at her side, with the water basin still in his hands. Cole with his palm still resting light against her back. Zane watching from the foot of the bed, with those dark, patient eyes that never seemed to miss anything. She'd been carrying something for weeks now. Longer, maybe. A truth she hadn't spoken to a living soul. Not because she was ashamed of it exactly, but because saying it out loud made it real, made it something that could be reacted to. And she wasn't sure she could survive the wrong reaction. But this cabin had already taught her something about survival. It had taught her that some truths, once spoken, made a person lighter rather than more exposed. "I'm still a virgin," she said. The words came out trembling. Her hands were fisted in the quilt, knuckles pale, and she made herself keep looking at them instead of dropping her eyes the way every instinct told her to. 3 years at that settlement, she continued, because now that the first truth was out, the rest of it wanted following. 3 years. And men there had every kind of power over me a person could have over another. My labor, my food, my safety, whether I lived or died some days. Honestly, and not one of them ever had that. I held on to it the way you'd hold on to the last coin in your pocket during a long winter. It was mine. It was the one thing that stayed mine. She looked up, finally meeting Wyatt's eyes, then Cole's, then Zane's. "I want you to know that, before anything else happens between us. I want you to know exactly what you'd be the first of. And I need you to understand, I'm frightened. And I need you to understand I want it anyway." The room went silent except for the fire and the wind still working at the shutters outside. Josie watched something move through all three men at once, a kind of unified stillness settling over them. And for one terrible moment, she thought she'd said something wrong. Misjudged the moment entirely. Then Wyatt set the water basin down, careful, deliberate, and took her hand in both of his. He pressed his lips to her knuckles, slow, reverent. The kind of gesture a man makes when words alone aren't sufficient to the moment. Cole reached up and brushed a few sweat-damp strands of hair back from her face, his big, rough hand gentle as a whisper against her temple. Zane moved from the foot of the bed and knelt beside her, and rested his forehead against hers, close enough that she could feel his breath, steady and slow, working like an anchor against her own racing pulse. "Then we'll take it slow," Wyatt said. Cole's voice came right behind his, quiet and certain. "Slow as you need. However long that takes," Zane murmured. so close his words were almost felt rather than heard. Josie's eyes filled, and this time she didn't fight it. Didn't press it back the way she'd trained herself to for 3 hard years. She let the tears come, and none of the three men treated it as anything but exactly what it was: relief. Finally, after a long time, without any, "I'm scared," she admitted. "That's allowed," Wyatt said. "Fear and wanting something aren't opposites. You can hold both. Just tell us when to stop, or slow down, or wait, and we will. Every single time, without question, without you needing to explain yourself. That's not a kindness we're doing you. That's just how this has to work, for it to be worth anything at all." She nodded, and something in her chest that had been clenched tight for 3 years finally began, slowly, to unclench. What followed was unhurried, in a way Josie hadn't known intimacy could be. It was Cole's hands learning the shape of her carefully, pausing at every scar, not with hesitation, but with something closer to tenderness. Like each mark deserved its own moment of attention rather than being rushed past. It was Wyatt's voice, low and steady in her ear, checking in without breaking the mood, asking without demanding, listening for every small sound she made and adjusting to it. It was Zane's stillness turned into something entirely different, an intensity of focus that made her feel, for the first time in her life, completely and entirely seen. There was no part of that night that happened without her clear participation. Every step forward came because she reached for it, asked for it, or simply stopped hesitating long enough to let it happen. When she needed a pause, they paused, without complaint, without impatience, without ever making her feel she owed them an explanation for needing it. When she was ready to continue, they read that too, in the way three people who had spent weeks learning to read her could. By the time the fire had burned low, and the storm outside had softened to something gentler than a howl, Josie lay wrapped in warmth on every side, 3 sets of arms holding her like something precious, rather than something owed. And she understood, with a clarity that felt like the first true thing she'd known in years, that this was what it was supposed to feel like. Not a transaction, not a debt, not a thing given up in exchange for safety, a choice, freely made, received with the kind of care that turned an old wound into something closer, finally, to healed. She slept that night without a single dream of the settlement. The storm broke on a Thursday morning, the sky clearing to a hard, bright blue that felt almost aggressive after so many days of gray. Wyatt, Cole, and Zane went out early to dig the drive clear and check on the stock, and Josie stayed back at the cabin finishing the morning chores, feeling lighter than she had, and longer than she could remember. She heard the gunshot before she heard anything else. It cracked across the clear morning air, sharp and sudden, and Josie was moving toward the window before her mind had fully caught up with what her body already understood. 6 riders, coming up fast from the tree line near the stables, where the brothers had been clearing the last of the drifted snow. She recognized Thorne himself at the lead, unmistakable even at this distance in his black coat and wide-brimmed hat, and behind him 5 hired men, all armed, all moving with the particular confidence of people who'd brought overwhelming numbers to a fight they intended to win. The brothers had been caught in the open. She could see them now, pinned down behind an overturned feed trough near the stables, Wyatt's rifle answering fire in short, controlled bursts. Cole and Zane behind the same meager cover. All three of them outnumbered nearly 2 to 1 and out of position. Josie's mind went very clear and very fast, the way it used to during the worst moments at the settlement. When panic would have gotten her killed, and calm was the only thing that ever kept her alive. She was not going to stand at this window and watch them die. She thought of the smithy. She thought of everything Cole had taught her. Patiently, over weeks of afternoons the color of hot iron, the danger of ore dust settled thick in closed corners. The exact warning he'd given her the very first day. Fire you can see coming. Dust settles on everything. And if it gets thick enough in a closed space and meets a spark. She didn't let him finish that sentence in her memory. She was already moving. She ran for the smithy at a dead sprint, keeping the structure between herself and the fighting. as long as she could manage it, and burst through the door into the familiar heat and dimness. The forge was still glowing from the morning's work, banked low but alive, and along the rafters, in the corners behind the bellows. In the shadowed places Cole had shown her, weeks ago, the fine black dust had gathered. Same as always. Same as it always would, until somebody swept it out. She grabbed the leather bellows and, working fast, began packing loose powder from the swept piles into a cloth sack, the way she'd watched Cole do a dozen times when preparing a controlled charge for splitting stubborn rock. Her hands were steady. Her mind stayed narrow and focused, blocking out everything except the specific task in front of her. She hauled the sack near the open smithy door, angled toward the stable yard where the fighting raged, and she struck a length of iron against the forge's edge until a spark caught. The explosion of dust and smoke that followed wasn't a killing blast. It wasn't meant to be. It was a wall of choking black smoke and blinding light, rolling out across the yard in a single tremendous cough, disorienting every man caught in its reach. Thorne's hired men scattered, coughing, half-blind, firing wildly in every direction except the right one. It was exactly the opening the brothers needed. Josie grabbed the Winchester rifle that hung above the smithy door, kept there. She now understood, for exactly this kind of circumstance, and took up a position at the window, using the thick stone edge of the forge wall as cover the same way she'd used it herself. Weeks ago, hiding from Garrett's men. She had fired a rifle exactly 4 times in her life before this moment. All of it under Zane's patient instruction over the past few weeks. Careful lessons she'd assumed at the time were simply another kindness. Another skill offered without an agenda attached. She understood now that nothing the brothers taught her had ever been offered without purpose. They had been preparing her, gently, without ever once making her feel like a project or a task. They had simply been making sure that if a day like this ever came, she wouldn't be standing helpless at a window. She sighted down the barrel at the smoke-choked yard, found a target one of Thorne's men, disoriented, stumbling clear of the smoke with his rifle raised toward where Wyatt crouched and fired. The man dropped his weapon and grabbed his shoulder, spinning away. Out of the fight, she worked the lever, found her next target, fired again, this time driving a man back behind cover rather than hitting him outright. But it was enough. It bought Cole the half-second he needed to come up over the feed trough and put a hired man down with a single well-placed shot. Zane moved through the smoke like it was simply another kind of forest, silent and sure. And 2 more of Thorne's men went down before they'd even registered he was among them. In under 3 minutes, it was over. Thorne stood alone in the settling smoke, his 5 hired men scattered wounded, fled or disarmed, his black coat stained gray with ash. His composure, for the first time since Josie had known of him, entirely gone. He turned in a slow circle, taking in the 3 brothers closing in around him with weapons raised, and the woman standing in the smithy doorway with a rifle, still trained steady on his chest. "You," he said, staring at Josie, like he genuinely couldn't reconcile what he was seeing. "You did this. I learned it here," Josie said, and her voice didn't shake at all. "Everything you took 3 years trying to teach me, I was worth nothing. These people undid in a season. Turns out I was worth quite a lot the whole time. You just never had any use for finding that out." Wyatt closed the last few feet and took the judge by the collar, none too gently, and hauled him upright. "Nathaniel Thorne," he said, "you're under citizen's arrest for attempted kidnapping, assault, and I expect a territorial marshal's going to find plenty more to add once he's had a proper look at your ledgers. You have no authority." Thorne spat. "I've got a rifle, 4 witnesses, and about to have a great deal of authority once this reaches the marshal's office," Wyatt said. "Funny how that works out." Cole came up beside Josie and looked at the smithy door, at the last curling wisps of smoke drifting out of it, and then at her, standing there with the Winchester still steady in her hands. "You remembered the dust," he said, something like awe in his voice. "You taught me well," Josie said. "I taught you plant medicine and forge safety," Cole said. I did not teach you how to turn a smithy into a battlefield weapon. No, she agreed, lowering the rifle finally, her hands beginning to shake now that the danger had passed. And there was room, finally, for the shaking to happen. That part I figured out on my own. Zane came to stand at her other side, and for a moment, none of them said anything at all. Just stood together in the settling smoke and the bright winter sunlight, looking at Thorn bound and furious in Wyatt's grip, looking at the wreckage of the fight scattered across the snow, looking at each other with the particular relief of people who'd nearly lost everything and hadn't. Let's get him to town, Wyatt said finally. This ends today. The ride into town took the better part of 2 hours, and nobody talked much along the way. Thorn rode in front, wrists bound to the saddle horn, his black coat still gray with ash from the smithy fire. He'd stopped protesting somewhere around the first mile. Once he understood that neither pleading nor threatening was going to move Wyatt Holden an inch. He just stared straight ahead now, jaw tight, the look of a man doing arithmetic he didn't like the answer to. Josie rode behind him, the Winchester still slung across her, back out of habit more than need. Her hands had stopped shaking sometime after the second mile. She watched the back of Thorn's head and found she didn't feel what she expected to feel. Not triumph. Exactly. Something quieter than that. Something closer to relief. Finding a place to finally set itself down. The town of Larkspur Gulch wasn't much to look at. One main street, packed dirt turned to slush by the thaw. A row of storefronts leaning slightly into each other, like old men sharing gossip. But word traveled fast in a place that size, and by the time the 5 of them came around the last bend, people had already started gathering on the boardwalks. A judge riding bound into his own territory tends to draw a crowd. That's him, someone said, low from the porch of the Mercantile. That's Thorn, bound like a common thief, said another voice, disbelieving. Wyatt kept them moving at a steady pace toward the marshal's office at the far end of the street, not rushing, not slowing, letting the town see exactly what it needed to see. Cole rode close on Thorn's other side. Zane hung back a little, the way he always did, watching the crowd instead of the prisoner, making sure nobody in that gathering crowd had a mind to intervene on the judge's behalf. Thorn found his voice again about halfway down the street. You people don't understand what you're doing, he said, pitched loud enough to carry to the boardwalks. I am a sitting judge of this territory. I have friends in the capital. I have connections that reach further than you can possibly imagine. And when this is sorted out, and it will be sorted out, every one of you is going to answer for it. Sorted out with a marshal, then, Wyatt said, not looking at him. That's where we're headed. You think a federal marshal is going to take the word of a runaway and 3 mountain men over a judge's word? Thorn twisted in the saddle, trying to catch Wyatt's eye. I have signed contracts. I have court records. I have 3 years of legal paper, backing every decision I've made regarding that woman's debt. Funny thing about paper, Wyatt said, doesn't mean much once somebody starts asking where it came from. They reached the marshal's office, and Cole swung down first, helping Thorn off his horse with considerably less gentleness than the judge was accustomed to being handled with. A small crowd had gathered a respectful distance back, murmuring, and Josie could feel the weight of all those eyes on her, on the state of her clothes, on the rifle across her back, on the general strangeness of the whole procession. She had spent 3 years being invisible on purpose, keeping her head down, making herself small enough that nobody looked twice, standing here now, in the mud of the main street, with every eye in town fixed on her, was its own kind of test. She didn't look away from a single one of them. The marshal, a broad, unhurried man named Otis Reyes, came out onto his porch to meet them, taking in the scene with the calm of someone who'd seen plenty of strange things ride into his jurisdiction over the years, but not usually a bound judge among them. Wyatt Holden, he said, this is a new one, even for you. Got a citizen's arrest for you. Marshall attempted kidnapping. Assault, and I expect a good deal more, once you've had a look at what he's been running out at that settlement. Reyes looked at Thorn for a long moment, and something in his face suggested he'd had his own private suspicions about the judge's operation for longer than he'd ever said out loud. "That right," he said. "Well, bring him in then. We'll get statements." It was as he said it that Josie swung down off her horse and reached into the saddlebag she'd carried the whole ride into town, careful not to jostle its contents. The ledger. She'd taken it from Thorne's own coat during the fight at the stables, in the chaos after the smoke cleared, when nobody had been paying attention to what a woman with a rifle might also be doing with her free hand. She hadn't told the brothers she had it. She'd wanted, more than anything, to be the one who handed it over. She stepped forward, past Wyatt, past Cole, until she was standing directly in front of Thorne, close enough that he could see exactly what she was holding. His face went the color of old ash. "That's private property," he said, and for the first time since she'd known of him, his voice actually cracked. "You have no right." "I have every right," Josie said. "I spent 3 years being one of the names written inside it." She opened the cover. The whole street had gone quiet now, the crowd pressing in a little closer, straining to hear. She turned the pages slowly, deliberately, until she found the section she wanted. The long columns of names and dates and dollar amounts that never seemed to shrink, no matter how many years of labor got entered against them. "Josephine Vance," she read aloud, tracing the line with one finger. "Debt inherited. Father's estate, $1,100. Labor credited against debt. 3 years, 4 months. Remaining balance." She looked up. $1,400. It went up. In 3 years of work, it went up. A murmur ran through the crowd, uneasy. The sound of people doing math they didn't like the answer to either. "That's how interest works," Thorne said, though the conviction had gone out of his voice. "That's how theft works," Josie said, "when you write the interest rate yourself. And there's nobody with the authority to check your math. And the person paying it isn't allowed to leave until it's settled, which it's designed never to be." She closed the ledger. "There are 40 names in here. 40. I read every one of them on the ride into town. Some of them are dead. There's a line through their name and a word next to it. Settled, it says. Like dying paid off what you owed." She threw the ledger. It landed in the mud at Thorne's feet, splayed open. Pages already soaking up the wet ground. Ink starting to run. "I already sent a copy to the federal marshal's office in the Capitol," she said, 3 weeks ago. "Cole wrote it out for me the day after the storm broke, before you ever came for the brothers at the stables. You've had a copy of your own crimes sitting in a federal office this whole time, and you didn't even know it." Thorne stared at the ruined ledger in the mud like it was the only thing in the world he could see. "You don't get to write down a person's worth on a page," Josie said, and her voice carried clean down the whole length of the main street, steady in a way she hadn't known she had in her until this exact moment. "You never did. You just had enough men with guns backing you up that nobody ever told you otherwise. Well, somebody's telling you now." The crowd along the boardwalk had gone entirely silent. 40 or 50 people watching a woman in worn clothes stand over a bound judge with a rifle on her back and absolute certainty in her voice. And something about the sight of it seemed to settle a question that had been sitting unspoken in that town for longer than anyone wanted to admit out loud. Marshal Reyes bent down and picked the ledger up out of the mud himself, turning through a few pages with a grim expression settling deeper into his face with everyone. "Well," he said finally, "this is going to take some sorting out." He looked at Thorne. "Get him in a cell. I'll wire the territorial court myself. Tonight, given what I'm looking at here." 2 of his deputies came forward and took Thorne by the arms. And for the first time since Josie had known anything about him, the judge didn't say a single word. He let himself be led away in silence, past the crowd, past the boardwalk, into the marshal's office, and the door closed behind him with a sound that felt, to Josie, like something finally, properly ending. She stood there a moment in the mud, breathing. Wyatt came up beside her first. "You never told us you had the ledger." "I wanted to be the one to hand it over," she said. "Not you. Not any of you, me." He looked at her for a long moment, and there was something in his face that wasn't quite a smile, but sat close enough to one. "Fair," he said. Cole clapped a hand on her shoulder, careful of the scar there the way he always was. And Zane, standing slightly apart from the others as usual, gave her the smallest possible nod, which she'd learned by now meant more from him than a whole speech would have meant from anyone else. The crowd on the boardwalk started to break apart, people drifting back to their business, though the whispers followed the four of them all the way to the livery. And Josie understood that whatever else came of today, the story of it would be told in that town for years. A woman standing over a corrupt judge in the mud of the main street, telling him plainly that his ledger meant nothing, that no man got to write another human being's worth on a page and call it law. She found she didn't mind being talked about, so long as this was the story they told. 6 weeks later, the snow was gone. It happened the way it always happened in the high country, slow and then all at once. Gray drifts shrinking back from the tree line day by day, until one morning Josie woke up and realized the ground outside her window was actually green, properly green. The first real color the ranch had seen since October. Thorne was 3 states away by then, sitting in a federal penitentiary awaiting trial on charges that had grown considerably since the marshal's office finished going through his ledger. 40 names, it turned out, had been only the ones still living at the time of his arrest. The full accounting, once the territorial court got involved, ran considerably higher, and word had already reached Larkspur Gulch that at least a dozen families were preparing suits of their own against what remained of his estate, his operation. The whole ugly machinery of debt and hounds and forged warrants had come apart in the space of a single winter, the way rotten things sometimes do once somebody finally shines a light directly on them. Josie thought about it less than she expected to. There was too much else filling up her days now for Thorne to take up much room in her mind. She stood that morning in the little land office in Larkspur Gulch, in a dress Cole had ridden 2 towns over to find her, waiting her turn, behind a farmer filing a boundary dispute and a widow renewing a grazing lease. The clerk behind the counter, a thin, patient man named Abernathy, had a stack of papers in front of him and a pen that needed refilling twice before he got through what Josie needed done. "Homestead Act filing," he said, mostly to himself. Flipping through the paperwork Wyatt had prepared weeks in advance. 160 acres, adjoining the existing Holden parcel. "You're filing this as sole claimant, Miss Vance." "I am," Josie said. He glanced up at her, a brief, assessing look, the kind she'd gotten used to over the past 6 weeks from various officials in various offices. A woman filing land in her own name, unmarried, with no father or husband co-signing the claim, was not the most common thing this particular office saw. "You understand the requirements," Abernathy said. "Improvement of the land. Residency requirement, 5 years, before the claim is finalized and the deed is yours outright. I understand them, and you intend to meet them. I've been meeting requirements a lot harder than that for longer than you'd believe." "Mr. Abernathy," Josie said, "this one I intend to enjoy." That got the ghost of a smile out of him, and he turned the paper around and set it in front of her and pointed to the line at the bottom. Josie looked at it a long moment. 6 months ago, she had signed her name to a debt contract that told her, in official language, that she belonged to someone else, that her labor and her time, and very nearly her body, were the collateral against a debt she'd never agreed to and could never actually pay down. She had signed that paper because she had no other choice, because refusing wasn't a freedom that had been available to her. This paper was different. This one, nobody was making her sign. This one existed because she'd asked for it. She picked up the pen. Wyatt, Cole, and Zane stood just behind her, close enough that she could feel them there without needing to turn around and check. The 3 of them having ridden into town that morning, specifically to watch this exact moment happen, though none of them had said as much out loud. They didn't need to. She'd learned, over the winter, to read the things they didn't say as clearly as the things they did. She signed her name, Josephine Vance. in careful, deliberate letters, sitting equal on the page beside Wyatt's own signature on the adjoining Holden parcel. Two separate claims that would, functionally, run as one household, the way plenty of ranch families out past the reach of town gossip quietly arranged their lives. Abernathy blotted the ink, stamped the paper twice, and slid a copy across the counter to her. "Congratulations, Miss Vance," he said. "You're a landowner." She stared at the paper for a long moment. Her name, her land, nobody's collateral, nobody's debt, just hers, plainly and legally, in a way that could not be argued away by a corrupt judge or a forged warrant or 3 years of somebody else's ledger. She felt Wyatt's hand settle at the small of her back, warm and steady, and Cole's low laugh somewhere near her ear, and Zane saying nothing at all, which by now she understood as its own kind of celebration. "Well," Cole said, "guess that makes it official. Can't burn a woman's beans and call her a hired hand anymore. You're the landlady now." "I was never a hired hand," Josie said, folding the deed with careful hands. "I believe somebody told me that himself, back in the fall, right before he threw my old contract into the fire." "I did say that," Wyatt agreed. "Turns out I was right." "You're usually right," Zane said. "Word of advice. Don't tell him that too often. Head won't fit through the cabin door." They rode back out of town together that afternoon, the four of them, the mud of the main street drying under a proper spring sun for the first time in months. Josie kept the deed folded carefully inside her coat, in the same hidden pocket, where she'd once carried a very different kind of paper. And she thought there was something fitting in that, the same pocket, a completely different life inside it. The ranch, when they came up over the last rise toward home, looked different than it had the night she'd first stumbled toward it, half frozen and bleeding. The same buildings, the same barn, the same low cabin with its peaked roof. But the whole property had shed its winter coat entirely now. Green pushing up through the mud along the drive, the creek running loud and fast with snowmelt, the whole mountain waking up around them. They rode up along the ridge that marked the property line, the new boundary that was as much hers now as anyone's, and reined in a moment to look out over it together. The smithy's chimney sent up its usual thin curl of smoke. The chickens. Wyatt had finally gotten around to buying that spring scratched at the yard, somewhere down past the barn. A horse called out, low and unbothered, the same kind of sound Josie had heard that first terrified night. Except she understood now that it had never meant her any harm at all. She had come to this mountain a debt, a number, a piece of collateral, running for her life through the snow. She left that same version of herself somewhere back along the trail, buried under 6 weeks, and a winter, and a whole education in what it actually meant to be treated like a person instead of a ledger entry. What rode this ridge now, in the thin gold light of a proper spring afternoon, was something else entirely. A landowner, a partner in a household built on nobody owning anybody. A woman who had chosen, freely, exactly what shape her own life would take, and who intended to go right on choosing it, one clear morning at a time, for as long as this mountain would have her. The 4 horses moved together along the ridge, unhurried, their long shadows stretching out across the thawing earth behind them, and nobody said much of anything. Because by that point, between the 4 of them, there wasn't much that still needed saying out loud. Josie Vance's journey reminds us that freedom is more than escaping the place that imprisoned us. True freedom begins when we stop believing the lies our captors taught us about our worth. For 3 long years, Josie was treated like a number in a ledger, a debt to be collected, and a body whose labor belonged to someone else. Judge Thorne tried to convince her that a piece of paper could define her value. Yet the moment she reached the Holden Ranch, she slowly discovered a truth that had always existed, even when she could not see it. No human being is property, and no debt, wound, failure, or painful past can erase a person's dignity. The Holden brothers did not save Josie by controlling her life or making decisions for her. They gave her safety, patience, and the freedom to choose. Wyatt protected her without demanding obedience. Cole helped heal her wounds without making her feel ashamed of them. Zane watched over her quietly, expecting nothing in return. Their kindness showed that real love does not create another prison. It does not demand payment, use fear, or force gratitude. Real love makes room for a person to speak, heal, grow, and become strong enough to stand on their own. But Josie's story is not only about being rescued. In the end, she became one of the rescuers. Everything the brothers taught her medicine, forged safety, courage, and self-defense became the tools she used to protect them and defeat Thorn. The frightened woman, who once collapsed in a barn, eventually stood before an entire town, faced the man who had enslaved her, and declared that he had never possessed the right to determine her worth. That transformation teaches us that healing does not make us forget what happened. Healing turns pain into wisdom, fear into courage, and survival into purpose. The deed Josie signed at the end represented far more than land. It symbolized ownership of her own future. Once, her name appeared on a contract that stole her freedom. Now that same name stood proudly on a document she had chosen to sign. Her life no longer belonged to a judge, a debt, or the expectations of others. It belonged to her. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of this story. Your past may explain your scars, but it does not decide your destination. Sometimes family is not the one we are born into, but the people who protect our dignity and help us remember who we truly are. No matter how long someone has been made to feel powerless, one act of courage, one safe place, and one person willing to stand beside them can become the beginning of a completely new life. Thank you for staying with Josie through her journey from captivity to freedom. And remember, no one else has the right to write your worth on a page. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more unforgettable stories from the wild frontier. The story you are about to read is entirely fictional, while it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences. It does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations.